Hello, I'm Hannah New, the Marketing Manager for the University of Utah Press, and welcome to our first podcast. With me today is Scott Abbott, whose book, Immortal for Quite Some Time, won the Book Manuscript Prize for Creative Nonfiction in the Utah Arts Council's Original Writing Competition. The University of Utah Press then published the book in fall of 2016. Hello, Scott. Thank you for joining us.
Oh, it's a pleasure.
Great. Scott, before you read a piece of your book to us, I'd like you to give us a brief synopsis of what your book's about.
That's especially hard with this book, I think. My writing was precipitated by the death of my brother, so that part is clear. I started writing about him and about our relationship and about our family, and I've been writing this for 25 years since he died, and so it's got a lot of fragments, a lot of quotations, a lot of descriptions. It's a book about him, about sexuality, homosexuality, heterosexuality. It's a book about the Mormon Church that we both grew up in and that we both eventually left. It's a book about my brother, and it's a book about me.
Great. And will you read us a piece from your book?
All right. It starts in Boise, Idaho. That's where he was living when he died. And we got a call from the coroner of the county there asking if we were his kin, and we were. And we went up the next day to... Well, I'm not sure why we went up. Empty his apartment. We were his family, so we went. So the book starts with a chapter called Autopsy. And I note that the American Heritage Dictionary says that autopsy, the word is from the Greek, a scene for oneself. Auto, and opsis, sight. 23rd of July, 1991, 425 West Jefferson, Boise, Idaho. No children, no pets. Lila and Dean, managers. I'm Lila, the heat-drugged woman announces, edging her weight out of an overstuffed room into the hall. How can I help you? I explain we are his family. She says she is sorry. He seemed like such a nice man. We follow her up 2 flights of wooden stairs. Her key opens number 41. A battered refrigerator labors in the heat. Slick white maggots unsettle a thick layer of garbage under the sink. A double bed crowds the bedroom. Soiled latex gloves sprawl atop a trash can next to the bed. Beneath them, a desperate spattering of vomit. Cigarette butts, a peach can, an applesauce can, 6 beer cans, containers for aspirin, amoxicillin, Alupent. French doors lead me out onto a tiny balcony dominated by a single kitchen chair. I sit down, stretch my legs across 2 milk crates, and try to imagine him gazing across Jefferson Street at the well-tended gardens and the white dome of Idaho's state government. Dark clouds bunch over the mountains to the north. Purple thread dangles from a needle thrust into the chair back. Under the chair squats a can of turpentine, replacement, paint, solvent. The words feel weighty. I repeat them to myself. Turpentine, replacement, paint, solvent. In the slope-roofed living room, Christy holds up a cardboard box. The shapes of feet have been cut out of one panel. Jill pulls grease-soaked work shoes from under the bed. They are lined with new cardboard. A W-2 form tucked into a manila envelope reports last year's total wages as $13,235. A cash register tape lists his recent purchases: a case of Doral cigarettes, a 6-pack of Olympia beer, a bottle of Listerine, 2 bars of soap, a can of applesauce, and one of peaches. We stuff his things into plastic garbage bags, pile them into the van. A bearded man and a pregnant woman approach from the sidewalk. "Are you the family of the deceased?" the woman asks. My husband was the one who went into the room and found him. The cafe called the managers here and asked them to check why he hadn't come to work. My husband takes care of the place, so he went up. It's the second one he's found. We drive to his workplace, where a gray-haired woman is putting salt and pepper shakers on tables. We tell her who we are. I'm Alice, she says. She bursts into tears. Ted, a big man in suspenders, sits us down at a table. He worked for us for 2 years. Sometimes he slept in Saturday mornings. We'd send a waitress to wake him up, and he always came right over. One night he asked me for a $100 advance on his wages. The next day he walked in with flowers for all the waitresses. That's the way he was. We leave the cafe and drive to a mortuary. The mortician greets us and offers sincere condolences. I say I would like to see him. He explains that most family members, especially after an autopsy, find it better to wait until the body has been worked on. I explained that I need to see him now. We walk down a flight of stairs to the basement, the smell of pizza and the sound of laughter from a side door. 3 bodies laid out on tables. The mortician points to a clear plastic bag on the center table. I pull open the folded plastic. Don't touch him, he warns. His face is drawn, an open eye leers upward, a scraggly growth of beard and a thin mustache. The sagging jaw reveals uneven teeth. My teeth. A surgical Y from shoulder to shoulder, down the chest to the hips. The top of the skull has been sawed off. Severed locks of hair litter the forehead. I stand before his body. It is unspeakably present. His feet are livid, I wrote. Bags of his things lurk in the garage. They once reeked of cigarette smoke. Now they fail to retain even his most pungent odors. I'm losing him, molecule by molecule. I want to know him in ways I never did. I worry about contagion. I worry about worrying about contagion. I turn to our notebooks, his and mine. I gather photographs and documents. I let my mind slide back. I want more than the pale patterns memory settles into. I don't want to remember him. I want to smell his breath, thump his back, hear his voice. I'll have to make do with memory. My memories, not his. The memories of a brother. His feet were livid.
Thank you. I'd like to point out a piece that you wrote in your intro. You said, "This is not a memoir. Rather, this is a fraternal meditation on the question, are we friends, my brother? The story is uncertain. The characters are in flux. The voices are plural. The photographs are as troubled as the prose. This is not a memoir." So what do you mean when you say this is not a memoir?
Well, if it weren't a memoir, I wouldn't have to say that. So it's very clearly a memoir. But we all know what memoirs are. They're the story of somebody's life. They have a starting point. Sometimes it's with the grandparents, or sometimes it's with the birth. And then it goes through the troubled childhood and the teen years and into maturity, and it has some end. We know that arc. I didn't start to write this book as a memoir. When we found John dead, I just started writing. And I was writing, I think, to somehow to keep him present. He was gone, but I wanted to think about him, and I didn't want to forget him. So I started writing notes, and they became daily notes, and that's not the substance of a memoir. Those are, I guess I started calling them fraternal meditations. I wanted to think about my brother, and it became a daily practice, and it stretched over years. So the year 1991, that's a chapter of those fraternal meditations, and they're fragments, and they're incomplete. They don't tell a whole story, and they call themselves into question. So they don't have that arc, that general arc that a memoir has. Fraternal meditations.
Great. And you mentioned that these when I was reading the book, I noticed that these fragments take on multiple voices. So there's yours, there's your brother's, and and a female voice that challenges you. Will you discuss these voices?
So as it started to become a book, I was nervous about just telling one story and just telling my story. So there's a version of a book like this that shows happy childhood, and then the person goes off to college and realizes that his upbringing, in my case, his upbringing was problematic, and then starts to question and grows into maturity and realizes that those early years were bad, damaging, and so throws them over and becomes a much better person and heroically escapes the traps that his family and his Mormon church and his Western American socialization led him into. That's a really stupid story, and I didn't want to tell it. It's not my story. I have a really wonderful family, and they raised me really well. And a lot of the good parts of who I am, I learned by being a Mormon. And to deny either one of those would be like to deny important parts of myself. So I wondered how to tell a better story, or a different story at least. And I thought, what if I had a critical voice and a woman's voice, because I'm telling the story from a man's perspective, and a faithful Mormon's voice, because by this time I was no longer practicing. What would that do to the story? And it sets up a dialectic, I think. So I'm the thesis, she's the antithesis, and maybe a better story happens as a result of that. One of the things I worried about most as I was writing about my brother John was that we hadn't been close, and I felt bad about that. And I thought, are there ways I can bring his voice into the text? And so I at the end of each chapter, I have whatever he had in whatever notebook I'm using right then. He quoted things from books he was reading, and he wrote down recipes, and he played games. He wrote little poems, and he drew in the notebooks. So I include those. Those are his words, his drawings at the end of each chapter. And then as the book comes to an end, because I feel like I've gotten closer to him, I started wanting to talk with him. So I brought his voice in. I wrote it, obviously, but the same thing happens. He questions me and makes fun of me and challenges me. And so it feels like a fraternal conversation by that point. And then, so those are the three voices you mentioned, and they're set apart by different fonts in the text. But my mother's voice is obviously really important in the book. As I was writing about my brother, I realized I was also writing about myself. And that's the case with my mother, too. We have some big arguments in the book. She's a faithful Mormon and disagrees with many of the things I've come to believe. But her voice is in there, and it's a challenging voice. And then there are voices of my sisters and brothers and children. So I hope there are a lot of voices at work.
Great, thanks. So this book is a 25-year-long journey. So what are some things you discovered about yourself or your brother or your family or even possibly the Mormon Church while writing this book?
A lot of things, I guess. Nothing surprised me as I was writing. I came across things that I expected and that I already knew. But working with things, rethinking things, those are learning experiences. People sometimes talk about writing or any kind of art as a way to express yourself. That didn't feel right to me with this. I wasn't expressing myself. I was figuring things out. And I was developing myself and I was learning. And so the kinds of things I learned were, well, I'll give a couple of examples. I knew I'd grown up in a somewhat racist and quite homophobic family and religion. But thinking through that again and again and again in the book, I realized I didn't want that to be part of who I am, even though it was, that I needed to work it, think it, put it in context. So that was a development over the course of the book. As I went back to memories and texts and context from earlier life, I came across things like when I was a second-year student at BYU, the Vietnam War was on, and the draft was a requirement, and so I was available for the draft, and there was a meeting on campus, a required meeting of all male students. And it was sponsored by the ROTC and by the church leaders in the stakes and the wards that all the students went to on Sunday, co-sponsored. And the speaker was Hartman Rector Jr., a Mormon general authority who had been in the Navy. And he told us how important it was that we enter the service if we were drafted or even volunteer. The reasons he gave were that God builds his kingdom through events like this. And he said, as U.S. troops won the war in Japan, the missionaries moved in and started to build the kingdom of God. And the same thing happened in Korea. And he said, and the same thing will happen now in Vietnam. And he claimed that the blood of innocent people sometimes had to be spilled for God's kingdom, and that we should allow ourselves to be drafted. I was surprised. I still had a copy of that speech, and I was surprised at how direct he was. So there were lots of those memories that came back up as I was thinking and writing. Is that the kind of thing you were asking?
Yeah.
Could I ask you a question?
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. So it's a very, very Mormon book. And I'm wondering how people outside that religion might respond to such a Mormon book. And of course, I have the same question of people who are inside it. How are they going to respond? And I have my sisters in mind when I think that second question. But what are any of your responses to the book as you read?
Well, I was actually raised Mormon too, and I'm no longer practicing. And I found a lot of your thoughts very comforting, actually. It was comforting to read your experiences and to know that there are these struggles. My very first impression of your book, I came across it in a launch meeting, which happens pretty early in the publication process. The book has been approved for publication, but we haven't quite gone through the process yet. And this is introducing the book to the press. And of course, you have so many voices in your book. We were discussing how are we going to separate these voices? How are we going to show that this is a separate voice from this? And we, came across the fonts and the italics. And so as we're discussing this, I'm flipping through your manuscript, which I actually don't get to do very often. And I came across this line, and I almost just broke down in tears. And, when I'm loving you more than I can stand, I have to get you something. And a book is all I can think of. And as someone who works in the book industry, that was one of the most beautiful lines I'd ever read. So I quite enjoyed your book.
That was my fiancée at the time.
Oh, yeah?
I still have the fondest memories of that.
Do you remember what book you bought her?
She bought me the book, and it was Kierkegaard's Either Or.
Oh, nice.
Yeah.
Well, I'd like to wrap this up by having you read another piece from your book.
All right.
Thank you.
So this one, This one is set in London, and it's 1992, the 23rd of May. I've been looking at standing stones from Land's End to the Orkney Islands. And now, after 2 solitary weeks among ancient standing stones, stones lifting up their adjusted hope for immortality, I'm in London for a couple of days. I make a beeline for the National Gallery. Crowded rooms, long lines, famous paintings. I stand for a long time before Rembrandt's The Anatomy Lesson of Dr. Diamond. A former thief lies on his back, his feet toward the viewer, his body foreshortened, the cavity open just below his chest, his head forced forward. Skin and hair are peeled back to expose his brain, a piece of which the good doctor is drawing out with a pair of forceps. The coroner in Boise cut John open from stem to stern. His hands registered the vibrations of a scalpel pulled through resisting flesh. He knew John's body more intimately than any lover. And those lovers, those sweet and deadly lovers, knew him more intimately than did his brother. Neither lover nor coroner, I continue to write, to measure and probe with the instruments I have at hand. 26th of May, 1992, London. Sitting in a small park just off the Thames, a cool breeze teases the hair of a man and a woman and a 5 or 6-year-old boy. He plays with a plastic bat. His parents, I suppose at least one is his parent, sit together on a park bench. The man wears red Converse tennis shoes, faded blue denim pants, no shirt, and an open jean jacket with the head of an Indian chief embroidered on the back. The woman wears sandals, black denim pants, and a white shirt. They can't keep their hands off one another. I don't remember my own parents embracing. Our children will have gaping holes in their experience as well. He caresses her neck. Her hand moves on his thigh. The boy wanders over. He stands in front of them. He waves his bat and jumps up and down. 5:30 p.m., Trafalgar Square. I've been reading Derek Jarman's Modern Nature, a journal written in 1989 and 1990 after the filmmaker discovered that he was HIV positive. The passage in which Jarman describes boarding school officials catching him in bed with a boy named Johnny echoes my anger during John's funeral. Christ, what are you doing? You'll go blind. Then the blows rained down, millennia of frustrated Christian hatred behind the cane. We were shoved into the wilderness they had created and commanded to punish ourselves for all time, so that at last we would be able to enter their heaven truly dead in spirit. 7:30 p.m., Cottesloe Theater. Angels in America, a new play by Tony Kushner, an American writer I've not heard of. Under the heading Real-Life Characters in the Play, the program features pictures of Roy Cohn and Ethel Rosenberg. I turn the page and stare at a portrait of Joseph Smith. The program quotes Kushner. I wanted to write about 3 things: Roy Cohn, who had just died, AIDS, and Mormons. I had no idea what Mormons might have to do with Roy Cohn or AIDS, but I wanted to find out. The play's primary angel is described as the angel Joseph Smith incorrectly identified as Moroni. What have I stumbled into? During the intermission, I stand among women and men with whom I have just shared the brutality and humor of the first act. The play is about Louis, a gay Jew, and his drag queen lover who is dying of AIDS. Joe, an ambitious Mormon lawyer who protests when Cohn takes the Lord's name in vain and whose neglected wife compensates with Valium, fights to kill his homosexual urges. Joe's wife tells the drag queen that my church doesn't believe in homosexuals. My church doesn't believe in Mormons, the drag queen replies. Louis explains the Jewish view of the next life to his dying lover. Did John have any chance or inclination for such conversation? End of Act 2. The Mormon admits he is queer. The philosophic Jew leaves his dying lover. Roy Cohn has AIDS, is about to be disbarred, and needs the Mormon to cover for him in the Reagan Justice Department. There is violence, self-destruction, blood dripping from the dying man's ass, betrayal, self-loathing, beauty. Act 3, one of the characters speaks of the monolith of white America, white, straight, male America, which is not unimpressive even among monoliths. Joe makes several moral choices. He tells Roy Cohn he can't be dishonest, he won't take the Washington job, and he decides to spend the night with Lewis and go to Mormon hell. I'm brimming with compassion, burning with ideas as I come out. I'd better say as I leave the theater. I wish I could have seen the play with John. Did he even like plays? 27th of May, 1992. I've flown over Greenland before, but today for the first time. It reveals itself through scattered clouds. Sheer, sharp mountains thrust like shards of black glass through the frozen flesh of ancient snow, snow unmarked, untracked, unbroken, except where sheer verticality ruptures the pristine blanket. Lascivious liquid tongues lick between peaks and snowfields, mountains of ice random in the dark water. Flight is always precarious. Today the airplane feels precarious above the threatening mountains of Greenland. Yet the natural forces down there, terrible as they are extraordinarily beautiful from this perspective. Kant's sublime. I wake up as the plane eases over the Wasatch Mountains. Foothills glow in the setting sun like the tawny hide of a deer in perfect health. The familiar mountains are crumpled together in north-south convolutions, like brain tissue, not like glass shards. Tawny, not black and white. No snow left on the mountains. That's an ominous sign in the high desert.
Thank you very much.